The current president, Joe Biden, he weighed in on January 6th with a Washington Post op-ed, as one does, where he calls out the, quote, unrelenting effort to, quote, rewrite, even erase the history of January 6th, and implores us to commit to remembering January 6th every year because, quote, any nation that forgets its past is doomed to repeat it.
Don't you guys feel like an op-ed about January 6th is just the perfect encapsulation of how feckless everything feels in this moment?
Yes.
Yes. Well, yes.
Ain't nothing changed, nothing new here to see. This ain't nothing but some political maneuvering.
America.
Welcome to the eulogy, eat it up. It's called political buffoonery.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to This Week in DUMBmocracy, where we showcase some of the dumbest newsmakers of the week. I hope everybody had a joyous holiday season, a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, a Merry Kwanzaa, and a very Happy New Year. Unfortunately, my year started off pretty badly. I had a very, very bad cold. I couldn't speak for a good couple of days. You can imagine the peace that was in my house during those days. But we're back now, and I'm glad that you stuck with us while I was recovering, getting ready to get back to the grind here. And in getting back to the grind, we have to put a little bit of a bow around the 2024 election season. Because, as you guys know, on January 6th, the election was certified and Donald Trump is officially president-elect. The electors have been counted. Kamala Harris certified the election results. And we are on our way to inauguration time. This time's a little bit of limbo when you think about it, between certification and the inauguration. Not a lot's going to get done because you have an outgoing president who's, giving away medals of honor to a bunch of different people and trying to pardon the world in many different ways. But also you have this incoming president with their own agenda looking to be set up by a Congress that's already been sworn in. So what's a political commentator to do here, right? I decided we're going to take a look back and look forward at the same time. Obviously, with the certification of the election happening earlier this week, everybody was talking about January 6th. Obviously, Republicans want to move on from discussing it ad nauseum after 4 years of discussions from Democrats. But many Democrats want to hold on and never forget. Sounds very noble, doesn't it? They never want to forget what happened on January 6th, 2021. Well, the American people decided in the election that they're ready to move on, even if some Democrats aren't so ready, but there are some Democrats out there as well that are looking at their colleagues and saying, come on, enough already. We're going to go through all of this messaging about January 6th, what it means to the American people, what it doesn't mean to everybody. But before we do all that, I'm going to ask you guys to please subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss any other shows. And if you like what you see in here in this or any other video on the channel, smash that thumbs up button. Like, comment, share the show with your friends, all that really, really good stuff that's going to help this show growing thanks to the YouTube algorithm. Yeah, I know I screwed up the intro. I'm rusty, all right? It's been a couple of weeks since we've been doing this. But I want to thank you guys, as always, for tuning into the show, doing all that you can do to help share the show with your friends, all that stuff. And if you're a newbie that may have found this for the first time, I'm glad you're here. Happy New Year to you as well. We got a lot of great stuff coming up in 2025, including the relaunch of buffoonoftheweek.com in just a few short days. I'm going to tell you guys about that later in the week. And also the return of shows like this. We're going to be discussing some of the latest news and events, specifically for this video, the impact of January 6th, 4 years later, now that Trump is returning to the White House, how the parties look at it, and more importantly, how you, the people, look at that issue. Oh yeah, we're starting off 2025 with a bang, going to The View, specifically to Sunny Hostin and her very extreme leftist views concerning January 6th. Pay attention to the crazy comparisons that she's going to draw between the events in 2021 and other events in American history.
I think we need to find moral clarity, in this country. And I just remember after January 6th, you had someone like Mitch McConnell placing the blame on January 6th where it belonged, squarely on Donald Trump's shoulders.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be an overarching theme that you're going to see coming from the left, that in the direct aftermath of January 6th, everyone was blaming Donald Trump. Of course, that was the snap reaction going on here. Then, as years passed, as more evidence came out, as lawfare occurred throughout the nation against Donald Trump, that view softened because more facts came out, like Nancy Pelosi not requesting the National Guard that Donald Trump and his administration had allocated to be sent to the Capitol. 10,000 National Guardsmen. That didn't come out immediately in the aftermath.
Flashback!
We have responsibility, Terry. We did not have any accountability for what was going on there, and we should have. This is ridiculous. You're going to ask me in the middle of the thing when they've already breached the inaugural stuff that should we call the Capitol Police? I mean the National Guard? Why weren't the National Guard there to begin with?
They thought that they had sufficient
No,
resources.
that is not a question of how they had been. They don't know. They clearly didn't know, and I take responsibility for not having them just prepare for more.
The American people didn't have all of the information. And then, of course, we can talk about the select, quote-unquote, January 6th committee that destroyed records in their wake.
Can you confirm to us that the videotapes of Cassidy Hutchinson, the ones where she's now changing her testimony through the errata, that they are missing, they are gone?
That is true. I can confirm that, and all of the videotapes of all depositions are gone. I wrote a letter to Benny Thompson asking for them, and he confirmed that they did not preserve those tapes. He didn't feel that they had to, but according to House rules, you have to preserve any data and information and documents that are used in an official proceeding.
And we're even hearing now how the Republicans are going to be looking for investigations against Liz Cheney, possibly Adam Kinzinger, possibly Benny Thompson, and other members of Congress on this very select committee where Republicans couldn't choose their own members. There was so much shenanigans, so much buffoonery going on in the years subsequent where Democrats were trying to make this case against Donald Trump in order to prevent him from becoming what he is today, the once and future president. So Sunny Hostin wants to go back to those times of ignorance where the American people didn't have all the facts at their fingertips. Nothing had been disclosed to them of anything that we just talked about. She wants to go back to that time where everybody had knee-jerk reactions against Donald Trump. Can't go backwards, Sonny.
And then you started seeing people backtrack that and losing their moral center. You had Condoleezza Rice, I believe, on this very show saying, we need to move on from January 6th. I say no. You don't move on because January 6th was an atrocity. It was one of the worst moments in American history. And when you think about the worst moments in American history, like World War II, things that happened, like the Holocaust, chattel slavery, we need to never forget because past becomes prologue if you forget any race.
You got to be kidding me with those comparisons. We're going to compare thousands upon thousands of people dying in World War II, the atrocities against millions in the Holocaust, to the events of January 6th? It's kind of a whacked out position, kind of an unreasonable position that the majority of the American people don't share with Sunny Hostin if you read into the election results. And we're going to get to that in a little while. But this is the extreme left position that January 6th is the worst thing since, people died in World War II. Oh my goodness, all the pearl clutching here. Never forget. Much like people say never forget for maybe the worst homeland travesty in history, 9/11, right? Same sort of language, trying to evoke the same imagery. But now let's check out what people on the right are saying, and as predicted, they're not saying anything near what Sunny Hostin's been saying. Yes, I know we're going to CNN right now, but we're going to see Scott Jennings on CNN. Scott Jennings has been a true firebrand of the right, fighting the good fight on CNN. Ross Galloway and I spoke about this during Buffoon of the Year about why anyone like our good friend Ryan Godusky or any other conservative would go into the trenches on CNN face up against a majority of leftists in media, liberals in media, Democrats in media, and try to, scream into the wind, as it were. But Scott Jennings has been very successful in creating these soundbite moments for months now. He's a true rock star of the right now. And this discussion about January 6th is another one of those gems, because I want you to hear what Jennings says, of course, but also what the host says in this segment. It's very telling.
Scott, in a political sense, is it how we got here? Is interesting, and you can see the evolution. You can play all the sound bites from the days after, when you heard Republicans blaming Donald Trump, some being short of saying he should be impeached, saying he should be held accountable.
Notice the same tactic from the host here? Same thing that Sonny Hostin just said. How everyone had their snap judgments in the wake of the initial moments post January 6th. And how those snap reactions all militated against Donald Trump, even from the right.
And I just remember after January 6th, you had someone like Mitch McConnell placing the blame on January 6th where it belonged, squarely on Donald Trump's shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Kind of amazing how this is the talking point, right? But of course, these people don't talk to each other and set up the narratives like this. These hacks don't spread narratives among themselves so that they speak in one unified voice. Of course not. This is just coincidence. Or is it? That's the setup. Let's see the return from Jennings.
And 4 years later, we are here. It is a stunning political comeback attributed to how Trump played it afterward, how Democrats played it afterward, or something else?
Well, I think it's some mixture of everything. But to me, the big message is that in the United States, the people decide. And because of the disastrous 4 years that came after Donald Trump, the people decided to return Donald Trump to power. And that's fundamentally what happened. They looked at what happened on January the 6th. They looked at all the things Democrats claimed about Donald Trump, and they also analyzed every single decision that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris made, and they delivered Donald Trump a convincing victory 4 years later.
It is tough, though, Scott, because when you say the people decide, that's what people tried to make sure didn't happen on January 6th.
You guys hear that?
It is tough, though, Scott, because when you say the people decide, that's what people tried to make sure didn't happen on January 6th.
It's clear now, after the election, that the left's plan all along was to stop the people from deciding to vote for Donald Trump. It was to prevent Donald Trump from running. They openly admit it now because they failed in doing that. But isn't it amazing how the truth always comes out in the wash after the fact? The goal of the left was to stop the people from having a choice. Could you imagine someone saying that during the election season or during the run-up to election season? That's a stunning admission, in my opinion. And Scott Jennings is just, shaking it off and not needing to point it out, because I think the word is out about Democrats, how they're untrustworthy, how they don't deserve the confidence of the people, and the people responded by not voting for Democrats at any level of the federal government this past year.
Allowing the people to decide.
The machinery turned. It was a terrible.
The lack of acknowledgement of how bad it was in the aftermath.
I mean, I think a great many people have acknowledged it, but also what happened that day. The machinery turned. Mm-hmm. Joe Biden became the president. He had one of the worst terms of any U.S. president, and then the people scrambled back to Donald Trump. That is the history of what happened.
Pretty succinct if you think about it, right? Also think about what happened in the years in between, the way that Scott Jennings was saying, but also in the sense that Congress passed a law to shore up what happens on January 6th every 4 years, and made the role of the vice president very ministerial, so that they really can't make any rulings concerning validating electors, fake elector slates, and all the stuff that you've heard about in the past that people claim to have been committed on January 6, 2021. That being said, Scott Jennings is absolutely right. The will of the people won out here. People went to go vote. They were able to choose Donald Trump because Donald Trump successfully fought back the majority of the lawfare that was thrown at him, the aspersions of insurrection that were thrown against him that never stuck. Remember, Congress never ruled that an insurrection occurred. No one arrested for anything that happened on January 6, 2021 was ever charged with inciting or committing insurrection. Trump fought all that back, got himself on the ballot. Supreme Court ruled that he could be on the ballot in the case of what happened in Colorado, and the people had their choice, and they elected who they wanted. Pretty cut and dry if you ask me, but these are just feelings, impressions of what happened from Scott Jennings, from myself. Luckily, when we come back from the break, we're going to see some raw data and statistics that back up these impressions that you're hearing about right now. Like what you see so far? Go ahead and smash that thumbs up button. Also, leave us a comment and tell us what you're thinking. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another show. So, on what side do the facts and the figures fall when dealing with these dueling narratives about January 6th between extremists on the left and representatives on the right? Well, we're going to go to CNN again and listen to Harry Inton, their chief number cruncher, to see where the will of the people lie. We heard Scott Jennings talk about, well, the people voted, and January 6th wasn't foremost in their mind, and they're ready to move on. Meanwhile, Sonny Hostin was saying how we all need to clutch our pearls and never forget this travesty that's comparable to the Holocaust. Where do the American people stand on this issue? Harry's going to tell us right now.
So President Biden has an op-ed out this morning, basically saying that he hopes people don't memory hole what happened on January 6th 4 years ago, but is that an uphill battle?
This is interesting. This Biden op-ed is going to be discussed later on as well. Obviously, Biden falls in line with the Sonny Hostin narrative that we should never forget what happened on January 6th. Don't memory hole it, as the presenter here was telling us. Keep that in mind as we go through this video further.
You know who's here? You saw him. Senior data reporter Harry Enton.
Hi, Harry.
Nice to see you,
Nice to
sir.
see you.
Congratulations on the Bills.
Doing something.
Doing the one thing they shouldn't do, which was lose yesterday. Anyway.
Obviously, a reference to the NFL. I'm a Giants fan. My team is so out of it. And we're keeping our coaches and we're keeping our GM.
I have a tough time sleeping if Saquon goes to Philadelphia, I'll tell you that. As I've told you, just being out.
You know what? That's a rant for another day. Maybe we'll talk about that. You know what? Who's your NFL team? Let me know in the comments.
Views on Donald Trump and his responsibility for January 6th have changed, including how people feel he should be perceived politically, yes?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, I think if you go back, 4 years ago, right, Trump's role on January 6, 2021 should make him ineligible to be president. The clear majority of voters said yes, 56%, and that was including removal from office. But of course, Donald Trump won the presidency, and part of the reason why was because views on Trump completely shifted, including Trump's role on January 6, 2021 should make him ineligible for the presidency. By 2023, 2024, it was just 47%. So we saw this drop of about 9 points, and that, of course, is all the difference in the world, going from a majority to short of a majority. And of course, Donald Trump won the vast majority of the other 53% who did not believe that his role on January 6th would make him ineligible for the presidency.
Still a big.
This backs up my theory that as time progressed away from January 6, 2021, and more facts became available, like Nancy Pelosi's role, for example, like the workings of the January 6th Select Committee, for example, like the lack of disclosure of certain testimony from others on the committee who testified, like Kash Patel, for instance, all this information that never got out to the public or came out in the ensuing years ended up swaying people's opinion towards Donald Trump. The numbers don't lie in that respect, so we seem to be right in that analysis, that the more that Democrats harped on what happened on January 6th and the truth came out about other people's roles, Donald Trump's quote-unquote role in it diminished in the eyes of the American people. It probably also helped that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris ran the country into the ground when it came to inflation, when it came to foreign policy, when it came to economic issues. It runs the gamut. I'm sure that helps as well. But clearly, the numbers bear out what Scott Jennings was saying, that the American people cared less about what happened on January 6th.
Number, but not enough.
Correct.
Right.
This 9-point shift was tremendous.
All right, let's talk about the why behind it, Harry.
Yeah, why? All right, so part of the reason why is, okay, was Trump greatly responsible for the attack on the Capitol? You go back to January 2021, it was 48%. By the time of December of 2023, look at that. Again, a clear shift down to 37%. This is an 11-point drop, very much mirroring that drop that we saw that the folks said that, of course, would make him ineligible for the presidency. So that is part of the reason why, right?
And that bears the same resemblance that we were just talking about earlier. As time went forward, as more evidence came out, people started to see that Trump was not greatly responsible for what happened on January 6th. He had a role, according to some of them, I would think, but to say greatly responsible, as Democrats tried to hammer over everyone's head throughout those 4 years post January 6th and throughout the 2024 election season, people did not it didn't resonate with people. It just didn't resonate with anyone. Remember, Joe Biden said democracy was on the ballot. That was his opening salvo right around this time last year when he started running.
Flashback. As we begin this election year, we must be clear. Democracy is on the ballot. Your freedom is on the ballot. Without democracy, no progress is possible. Think about it. The alternative to democracy is dictatorship. The rule of one, not the rule of we, the people.
End of flashback. The American people weren't buying it. They didn't agree with Democrats. Probably because they were looking after their own pocketbooks. They were worried about national security, worried about the economy, stupid. All the things that voters care about, the kitchen table issues, inflation, and all the things we talked about throughout 2024 as we look back and look forward. The American people weren't buying what the Democrats, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the extreme propagandists that we see all the time, people weren't buying it.
Fewer folks thought he was responsible, greatly responsible for what happened on January 6th. But it's not just that. It's that people simply put didn't care as much about the attack on the Capitol. Look at
Holy crap, look at those numbers. January 6th is biggest memory of Trump's first term. Absolutely not. People remembered the economic prosperity, the job growth, the tough talk in overseas relations and international relations towards Putin and towards North Korea. They remember those moments. They don't associate Donald Trump as much with what happened on January 6th. 5% overall and 2% in the GOP. That's earth-shattering when you think about it. After all the work that Democrats put in to try to connect Trump to January 6th to make him unelectable. Did the opposite.
this. January 6th is your biggest memory of Trump's first term in office. By the time of 2024, look at this. Look at this. It was just 5%. Just 5% of Americans. And among Republicans, it was just 2%. So the bottom line is fewer Americans faulted Donald Trump or thought he was greatly responsible for the January 6th attack. And more than that, as it went into the rearview mirror, far fewer folks thought that it was their number one memory.
Yeah, and this is an extraordinary number, given that President Biden, when he was still in the election, was really putting this as his main.
Didn't matter.
Never really was registering. All right, how about views of the results of the 2020 election this 4 years later?
Yeah, you know, this, I think, says everything, right? Because part of the reason those folks attacked the Capitol was because they thought incorrectly that the 2020 election results, in fact, did not reflect the view of the voters. Votes were cast and counted accurately. GOP voters after a given election, just 31%. Just 31% thought that about the 2020 election. Look at this. It turns out when you win an election, far more Republicans thought that the votes were cast and counted accurately, 94%. That is a 63-point jump, John. And that, of course, is why I think today will be mostly just business as normal.
Counting the votes, which is Congress's actual constitutional role. Harriet, thank you.
This is a clip from Pod Save America. It's a left-leaning podcast hosted by Obama alum Jon Favreau. Not the Star Wars guy. He's in politics, this one. And they're discussing this op-ed in the Washington Post from Joe Biden that was discussed in the previous clip with Harry Enton. Listen to their reaction to the sentiments from Joe Biden, how we should never forget what happened on J6, I think you're going to find it pretty interesting.
The current president, Joe Biden, he weighed in on January 6th with a Washington Post op-ed, as one does, where he calls out the, quote, unrelenting effort to, quote, rewrite, even erase the history of January 6th, and implores us to commit to remembering January 6th every year because, quote, any nation that forgets its past is doomed to repeat it. Feels like the horse is out of the barn on that one. But what do you guys think? How is the country supposed to process the reality that Trump's actions on January 6th just weren't enough of a problem for most Americans to keep him out of the White House?
Don't you guys feel like an op-ed about January 6th is just the perfect encapsulation of how feckless everything feels in this moment?
Yes. Well, yes. This has bothered me for a while. Just indulge me for a second. The quote is, those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. But it's not about countries, it's about people. And the actual quote, if you go back and look at it, is not about like the magical ability to remember things. Like memories do not prevent insurrections. Like that's not what the quote's about. What the quote's actually about is if you don't remember anything, you're doomed to do the same thing over and over again. But if you're too mired in the past, right? If you become from the original philosopher, stubborn like an old man, you also become doomed to repeat yourself because you're not adaptable and you don't learn from what's happening in the actual present. And so like
that's pretty on the nose.
Yeah, it is pretty on the nose, Tommy.
Feckless, stubborn like an old man. They're referring to Joe Biden and his op-ed. These are Democrat strategists. John Lovett, you see there, and John Favreau and Tommy Vitor. If I pronounce your names wrong, guys, I'm sorry. I'll try to do better next time. All saying that this isn't the way to handle January 6th because the American people have spoken. They agree more with Scott Jennings than they do Joe Biden and Sonny Hostin. This is really interesting to me because this is the first sign I've seen from any sort of media, really, showing that there is a segment of Democrats that are actually learning their lesson from the 2024 election.
We are both remembering and repeating the past, seems this week.
I mean, a coup attempt wasn't disqualifying, and no amount of remembering is going to change that.
Right.
You know? And it's like, look, Biden and Congress, to their credit, Republicans and Democrats, passed a bill to make it more difficult to overturn the results of future elections on January 6th in the certification process. You know, they can beef up security, but there's just no getting around the fact that most Americans used a free and fair election to say that they're okay with a president who tried to overturn a free and fair election. Like we all have to live with that.
By the way, just as a side note, I know he mentioned a coup, and he was clearly referring to Trump there. After all, these are Democrats, right? But I can't help but think about the other coup that happened in 2024, the palace coup that happened where Democratic leaders and their donors basically kicked Joe Biden to the curb for being stubborn as an old man, feeble mind, feeble body that we talked about all through 2024, and installed their own designee in Kamala Harris. Or maybe that's debatable. Maybe Joe Biden foisted Kamala Harris on them as revenge, as we talked about during Buffoon of the Year. But be that as it may, it's interesting they talk about coups, yet they don't recognize the coup that happened on the left more recently that many people felt was just downright undemocratic in and of itself. It's interesting how we can all lie to ourselves when we talk about partisan politics. Those partisan blinders are very powerful.
One of the things we should learn from the recent past is Democrats performing virtue, explaining over and over again why the insurrection was so terrible. It didn't work. Like, this style of politics is not working. And like, we should also probably remember the recent past ourselves.
That's some good self-reflection from Lovett there. I'm very surprised because I don't see this happening a lot in mainstream media. Of course, this is a left-leaning podcast. They're not necessarily mainstream, but they're certainly a very prominent and influential podcast, and they're saying these things. Hats off to these gentlemen for doing that self-reflection, doing that work, because you're not seeing it in mainstream media where they talk about, the racists won, the misogynists won. It was the targeting of white males that won, and they're inherently racist, and they would have never voted for a woman or a woman of color, and all the other gobbledygook and BS that we heard throughout this sort of I don't know if you want to call it denial of an election result, or if you want to call it, blue anon, or whatever the case may be. All of the things about elections being stolen coming from the left now that we've been hearing, and all of the hand-wringing and pearl-clutching for the reasons why they lost. These people, these guys, they put in the work, and they came up with some pretty interesting conclusions that I happen to agree with in part. No one's going to get to the bottom of 2020 to find out what happened there with that election cycle, whether there were any irregularities that caused the results to change. It's in the rearview mirror. Same thing with 2024. It's in the rearview mirror now. We now have to move forward as a nation to actually the governing phase of politics and keep the promises that were made during that election cycle. I think it would be healthy for everybody to move on from January 6th, not forget it, but move on from it. Understand that it was an anomalous election affected by a pandemic that left the American people shattered in their confidence of the system. This election cycle seemed to rebuild some of that confidence in the election process and in the various states across the nation. But I think what would help everybody put January 6th further in the rearview mirror is if we get back to the business of state, get back to governing and fixing all those kitchen table problems that the American people used as the reason for their vote. But hey, listen, that's just my opinion on all this nonsense. As I'm losing my voice a little bit here, I'm done talking here. Let me know what you guys think. Let's get into the comments together. And as always, like and share this video with your friends, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you don't miss any other shows. I'm looking forward to restarting this conversation with y'all in 2025 so we can come to some answers about what's causing all of these shenanigans and buffoonery that happens every day this week in DUMBmocracy.
All views and opinions expressed here are not necessarily of the mainstream media and may offend some listeners. It's called political buffoonery.